In 1984, or rather George Orwell's 1984, written about 68 years ago, wrote of a world constantly at war, a world full of self-contradiction, where individuals are not allowed to express what they really believe. Most of us have unwittingly maintained and contributed to this, what is called Orwellian society. He called this doublethink. And this is something that you will often find in discussions of Soviet Russia. Natan Sharansky talks about being a dissident Jew in Soviet Russia, where publicly you had to express one opinion, and where your thoughts, your private thoughts, what you really held true and what you really believed, were kept in your own mind or only shared among a select group of friends. Today, I believe most of society has begun to perpetuate this policy of doublethink, where we are taught that our religion lives in one sphere and our politics lives in another. Never should the twain meet. Never should religious ideals spill over into the political, and vice versa. Never should the political spill over into the religious. Now, doublethink let me tell you exactly the definition of doublethink. Doublethink is the act of simultaneously accepting two mutually contradictory beliefs as correct. They are often distinct in social contexts. Doublethink is related to but differs from hypocrisy and neutrality. Also related is cognitive dissonance, in which contrary beliefs cause conflict in one's mind. Doublethink is notable due to a lack of cognitive dissonance. Thus, a person is often completely unaware of this self-contradiction. And I think a lot of us do succumb to this doublethink tendency. We do this because, again, we have one world where we have religious ideas and another world where we have political ideas. But as we look at our politics, as we look at media today, the coverage of the news, we find that our politics contradicts with our religious beliefs and vice versa. Our religion contradicts with our political beliefs. And we find there is this constant tension, this pulling from one side to the other. In American society, the term doublethink is often termed being politically correct. And to this date, post World War II, we have yet to see a world that does not want war, a world that desires to live in peace and in harmony, a world that does not want to take up arms against its brother or against fellow nations. There always seems to be some conflict that needs to be resolved. And the days that Micah and Isaiah refer to, where nation no longer rises up against nation, we have yet to see that. So how are we going to get to the world we are today, a divided world, a divisive world, to a world where there is peace and harmony? Now, if you guys have followed my work, you know that I'm not exactly one to shy away from sensitive topics. In fact, taboo ideas, taboo topics usually pique my curiosity. And they pique my curiosity because the old adage is that there is no possible resolution. There is no method, no formula, no policy that can possibly bring the world together on one page. But if scripture is true, then perhaps there is. If the words of the prophet stand still, then there is actually a paradigm. There is actually an idea and a concept that there is this idea of salvation, not for Israel, but there is this idea that the way of Yahovah is saving health for all nations of the earth, not just for Israel. In fact, Yahovah tells us that his way of life was meant to propagate life, not just physically, but in every aspect, spiritually, economically, to ensure peace upon a land. But today we find that many people view ancient Israel's law code, ancient Israel's constitution, as a way of life, as a law that was meant for only ancient Israel that dwelt on the promised land. Uh, I am very privileged, very honored to be able to interact with many people through emails, through uh, Facebook, and there's a lot of really rich discussions that take place. And I find that there are two views that usually emerge regarding ancient Israel's law, the law that God gave both at Mount Sinai and the one that he amended on the plains of Moab shortly before Israel entered the promised land. And these both views, whether we take the Christian view or whether we look at the view within Judaism, they both hold more or less that the law of Moses was only for the nation of Israel, ancient nation of Israel, that it really has no application for modern religious or political beliefs, and it certainly has no application for the future. For Christians, as most of you know, the Torah is nailed to the cross. Jehovah's system of law is no longer valid. This idea, the system of belief, also holds that the way of Yahweh was too difficult to obey the first time it was given to humanity at Sinai. But in many ways, this idea, this particular doctrine within Christianity, is the epitome of doublethink. Many Christians believe the law should be done away with, but at the same time, they still hold to the biblical ideas of liberty and justice and loving one's neighbor. Leviticus 25:14 teaches humanity that they should not oppress one another. This is part of the law of Moses, but yet Christians still believe in this. Exodus 20 verse 13 teaches that we should not murder, while Exodus 20 verse 15 teaches society that theft is wrong. Christians also believe this. And Leviticus 19:18 teaches that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. So Christians do indeed hold to the law of Moses. They do indeed uphold many of the teachings and the ideas that the law of Moses propagates. However, at the same time, in this realm of doublethink, they also believe that it's done away with. And this is what has led to the strife and the division that we see in the world today. Now, this is not exclusive within Christianity. Judaism also sees the law twofold. For Judaism, modern Judaism, the law is only for the Jews. In conversations that I've had with rabbis, they are adamant that Gentiles should not observe the Shabbat. They should not observe kashrut. And in fact, some conversations that I've had, they've been very adamant about this, that it is only for the Jews. You know, you can follow the 7 Noahide laws, but should you take the Torah to obey it to yourself, then somehow it's almost as though you have sinned in some way or another. But this again succumbs to the idea of doublethink, that God has one set of standards for the tribe of Judah or modern Judaism, and another set of standards for the rest of the world, that the Gentiles are somehow treated differently. Both sects really succumb to this tendency of doublethink, of separating reality from the religious, from separating the ideas and the policies that enlightened ancient Israel and thinking that it can have no application to the future. The idea that it is passé. But once again, we find that this idea, what we will see in the prophets, these ideas provide no saving health for the nations when we follow the policy of doublethink and the ideology of doublethink. So, what is the idea of that the prophets have? The idea that God shows forth? Is it one of one nation and one constitution, or is it the idea of many differing laws for many differing nations? We find that not only does this idea of doublethink exist in um, ideas of the future, but it also exists in the way that we approach real life situations and real life policies. So, what we're going to look at are the texts that talk about Israel's future. Before we can really talk about the relevance of the Torah for modern society, we have to see if the prophets even support the idea that the Torah is relevant for nations beyond the nation of Israel. So, that is going to be the first point that we are going to look at. Now, one of my favorite texts in all of the Bible is Deuteronomy 4, verses 5 through 8. This is the text where God tells Israel that his way of life, his hoch and his mishpat, are what make Israel a wise and understanding people. And if you'll follow me, we're going to begin in Deuteronomy 4, and we are going to read through verses 5 through verse 8. This is what Moses tells Israel. It says, "Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as Jehovah my God has commanded me, that you should do in this land where you go to possess it. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what nation is there so great, who has God so close to them as Jehovah our God in all things that we call upon him for? And what nation is there so great that has statutes and judgments so righteous as this law, which I set before you this day?" Now, if we are to confront our own doublethink and embrace truth, we have to ask some basic questions. First of all, notice that the statutes and judgments are what give Israel the wisdom and the understanding in the sight of other nations. This wisdom and understanding is not exclusive to Israel. Other nations, nations outside of Israel, are able to look at Israel's policy and they are able to discern it as wisdom. So this implies that this is empirical. These are standards that are objective and not subjective just within the nation of Israel. So to confront our own doublethink, is Israel's wisdom, the statutes and judgment, is right and wrong, only right and wrong within the borders of Israel and for solely the nation of Israel? Is murder only wrong on the land of Israel, or is it wrong in all nations? Is theft only wrong in the land of Israel, or what about adultery? Are these laws that are universal for all human society or just for the nation of Israel? And I am going to submit to you an emphatic answer of no, that these are universal laws and that these universal laws are the saving health and the salvation of all nations of the earth, not just Israel. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but Dennis Prager has produced a fantastic series on the 10 Commandments that is available on YouTube. He goes through the 10 Commandments and he really shows how they are the building blocks for any strong, enlightened society, how they produce freedom and stability in any nation of the earth today. And again, what he shows is that it's not just for Israel, it really is for all nations. And Moses stresses in Deuteronomy 4, 5 through 8, that it is the statutes and judgments, not belief, not desire, not hope, and not anything else that gives Israel wisdom and understanding, but it's actually doing the things that God has commanded Israel, following God's instructions. And this raises another question. What about oppression? Is oppression that's mentioned in Leviticus 25:17, is oppression only wrong within the nation of Israel? If you'll remember, towards the end of the nation of Judah, Jeremiah gathers all the elders of Israel, and he requires that they release their Hebrew slaves in accordance with the Release Your statute found in Leviticus 25, where every 7 years you allow your Hebrew servant to go free. This was a system. This was an economic system. This was a system of liberty that ensured that the stronger among Israel's society did not oppress the weaker and the less financially secure among Israel's society. And Jeremiah called the elders together to observe this statute so that they would not oppress their fellow man. But is oppression of those that are weaker among us, is this something, a value and a standard that is only wrong within the ancient nation of Israel, or only wrong within a future nation of Israel? Or is it a standard that is universally wrong for all nations and all societies? I will submit to you that God's salvation is healing health for all nations of the earth and not just Israel. So, what does it mean to be wise? Wisdom revolves around the idea of a soundness of an action or an idea. It's the application of experience, knowledge, and good judgment. And Moses tells us that other nations are able to see and to discern wisdom, knowledge, and good judgment. So this again involves something that is universal. When you read through Proverbs 8, you find again ideas of wisdom being and truth being something that is universal and a natural law that applies to all humanity. Now, we are familiar with the many verses throughout the Torah, as well as throughout the Tanakh, that make many, many promises to the nation of Israel. Exodus 4:22 tells us that Israel is God's firstborn son. Exodus 19 verse 6 states that Israel is a nation of priests. And Exodus 19.5 states that Israel is a peculiar treasure above all the nations of the earth. But where does this leave the other nations? What relevance does the way of Yahovah have for them in the future? Does God singling out the nation of Israel, the seed of Abraham, and making them his peculiar treasure, his nation of priests, does that by very nature exclude all the other nations of the earth from knowing God, having a relationship with him, or walking in his ways? Isaiah writes that when the wolf will lie down with the lamb, that nations will no longer make wars against nations. These are ideas that transcend Israel. They extend well beyond Israel's national border. And what it really alludes to is a world without doublethink, a world that can agree on what merits wisdom, on what is good judgment, and that can discern between right and wrong. Again, it is an idea that there is salvation, that there is healing salvation for the entire world and not just Israel. In Psalms 86, verse 8, David tells us that one day all nations will come and worship before Yahovah. The idea that David sets before us is that God governs all nations, not just Israel. And when God restores and heals the nations, they will bless and worship Yahovah. This is what David tells us in Psalms 86, verses 8 through 10. It says, among the gods there is none like unto you, O Yahovah, neither are there any works like unto your works. All nations whom you have made will come and worship before you, O Yahovah, and they shall glorify your name. For you are great and you do wonderful things. You are God alone. Notice that in this text, the worship of Yahovah that is done by nations other than Israel is not done begrudgingly. It is done out of a sincerity of heart. This is not a doublethink position where the nations really have one agenda and believe one thing against Israel's God, but they are brought into an oppressive, compulsory situation where they begrudgingly have to show some sort of worship and sort of allegiance to Israel's God. Not at all. Rather, the nations come before Yahovah and they willingly acknowledge that he is Yahovah alone and that his ways are indeed just. And what we find is that in this process, that the nation of Israel is really forms the bridge between the past that is divided and the past where there is a history of doublethink and the future where there is peace, harmony, and unity. It is Israel and Israel's history that really form this bridge between past, present, and future that engenders and allows this peace and healing for all nations. When you search the words of Torah and you search Israel's history, you find that the act of remembering, the cognitive, active uh, ability, and the cognitive, active choice to remember the past, to call into remembrance, is something that God actually commands Israel to do and commands us to do. Remembrance is one of the first steps to having a relationship with God, one of the first steps in a process of restoration is the act of remembering. So let me share with you some of the texts where God commands us to remember some very specific things. In Numbers 15:40, Deuteronomy 15:15, and Deuteronomy 24:18, God commands Israel to remember that they had been slaves in Egypt. In Exodus 20, verse 18, we are commanded to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Now, you can remember, if you will remember, the Sabbath in Exodus 31, verse 16, is given as a sign to Israel, showing that they are in compliance with their covenant with God. In Deuteronomy 7, verse 18, Israel is commanded to remember what God did to Pharaoh and to Egypt. And in Deuteronomy 8, verse 2, Israel is commanded to remember how God led them 40 years in the wilderness in order to humble and to prove them. Deuteronomy 32, verse 7, in the Song of Moses, Moses writes that he commands Israel to remember the days of old. And Numbers 15:39 commands us to remember all the commandments, the mitzvah of Yahovah, and to do them. So what we find throughout Scripture is this correlation, this association between remembering and salvation. They really do go hand in hand. Israel remembers God. She returns to him to obey all his commandments, and God restores her. He restores his salvation. This point is driven home within Israel's testimony of Deuteronomy 30. If you will turn with me to Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 through 4, we're going to see the importance of remembering for Israel's latter days salvation. This is what Moses writes regarding Israel's latter end. It says, "And it shall come to pass when all these things are come upon you, both the blessing and the curse which I have set before thee this day, that you will call them to mind among the nations where Yahovah has driven you." This is an act of remembering. When you call something into mind, you are actively remembering the blessing and the curse that God has put before you. Verse 2, it says, "And you will return to Yahovah your God, and you will obey his voice according to all that I command you this day, you and your children with all your heart and soul. That then Yahovah God will turn your captivity and have compassion on you, and he will return and gather you from all nations where he has scattered you. If any of you be driven to the utmost parts of heaven, from there will Yahovah your God gather you, and from there will he stretch you." Zechariah builds on this promise of Deuteronomy 30, Zechariah 10, verses 9 and 10. Zechariah builds on this act of remembering and speaks of a day when Israel will once again remember her past. In Zechariah 10, verse 9, he states, "And I will sow them among the people, and they shall remember me in far off countries, and they shall live with their children and turn again. And I will bring them again also out of the land of Egypt and gather them out of Assyria. And I will bring them into the land of Gilead and Lebanon, and place shall not be found for them." So, and also Ezekiel 6, verse 9 also speaks of this regathering. But notice this correlation between remembering Yahovah, remembering the way of Yahovah, and actively beginning to obey it. And this idea of also God remembering his covenants with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then God restoring Israel to the land. Leviticus 26, 44 through 45, contains the testimony of the Sinai covenant. This is the prophecy of what God would do for Israel's future. If Israel chose to obey, there were certain consequences, blessings that would ensue. But if Israel chose to disobey, there would be certain curses that God would place upon the nation of Israel. But even in those curses, even if Israel whole out wantonly disobeyed and totally rebelled against Jehovah, his way of life, and everything that he stood for, God's promises, his faithfulness to Israel yet remained. And in Leviticus 26, verse 44, this is God's promise. It says, "And yet for all that, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not cast them away, neither will I abhor them to destroy them utterly, and to break my covenant with them, for I am Yahovah their God. But I will for their sakes remember the covenant of their ancestors, whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the heathen, that I may be their God. I am Yahovah." So notice this pattern that is established in Torah. Israel remembers God. Israel remembers the Torah. Israel begins to obey the Torah. God then remembers Israel. God remembers his promises to Israel, and he reestablishes them on their land, and he reestablishes the covenants that he made with their forefathers. Throughout the patriarchal covenants in Genesis, God tells Abraham and Jacob that their descendants will be a blessing to all the people of the earth. And this blessing is reiterated in Genesis 13, 15, and through 16, where God says that he has given the land to Jacob's seed, and that he will make his seed as the dust of the earth. But beyond making them the dust of the earth, he states in Genesis 22, verses 17 and 18, that in the seed of Abraham shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. So where does this leave the other nations? If God remembers his covenants with Abraham and Jacob, if Israel's seed is destined to become a blessing to all the nations of the earth through the seed of Abraham and Isaac, that are to be as the stars of the sea in multitude, or the stars of the heaven in multitude. How does this relate to the other nations? And how is it that God's promises to Isaac and to Jacob will endure and will become a healing salvation to all the nations of the earth? Well, when you think about the scenario, when you think about the plan of salvation that God has established within Torah, you find that God really speaks of salvation first to the nation of Israel. And I don't know how many of you guys have flown. I imagine quite a number of you. But whenever you take off in an airplane, there is this public service announcement that is given that says that should something happen during the flight, that before you should put on the oxygen mask of the person sitting next to you, you should first put on your own first and then assist others. In other words, you have to help yourself before you can help those around you. And you find that this is really the scenario God has set up, the purpose for the nation of Israel. And that is, before Israel can become a light of the nations, Israel really has to remember her own past. Israel has to return to Torah before she can help the other nations do the same. Isaiah 49, verse 6, speaks of Jacob being God's servant, of Jacob being a light to the Gentiles, that he may proclaim God's salvation to the ends of the earth. But what happens in this process? What happens when Israel no longer lives in this world of doublethink, where the descendants of Jacob wholeheartedly embrace the way of Yahweh, when they apply it not just to their religious life within their communities, but it actually spills over into their politics? Will it produce dissent? Will it produce conflict? Or will it produce the peace and the harmony that world peace can afford? We find that the topic of this peace and harmony again goes beyond the borders of Israel and beyond the nation of Israel. We find that Israel does not live in a vacuum. When we look at the recent treaty that America made with Iran, when we look at the sale of arms, when we look at the support for the nation of Israel, or the UN's recent sanctions, or the statement against the state of Israel, all of these play into modern politics, into real world scenarios that affect not only the state of Israel, but this future idea of peace, health, and restoration. So, what happens when a people, a group of people within society, no longer fall prey to doublethink, when our ideas come together and where we can stand on solid ground without hypocrisy, without self-contradiction? You find throughout scripture that this becomes a powerful source for righteousness, a powerful source for change in the future. You know, we saw how God commands us to remember. God commands us to remember the past, to remember his way of life, to remember his Torah, and to do it. But Israel is not the only nation that remembers. Israel is not the only nation that begins to acknowledge the righteousness and the wisdom of God's judgments in the earth. In Psalms 22, David tells us that the ends of the world will one day remember Yahovah. And when they remember Yahovah, like Israel, they will also turn to him. In Psalms 22, verses 27 and 28, this is what David tells us. He says, all the ends of the world will remember Yahovah, and they will turn to Yahovah. All the kindreds and the nations shall worship before you, for the kingdom is Jehovah's, and he is governor of the nations. The word turn, Yeshub, is that David uses in Psalms 22, verse 27, is the same word that is used in Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 and 2 for Israel, when Israel remembers Yahovah among the nations, and when Israel returns to Yahovah. If the ends of the world remember Yahovah, if they turn from their ways and acknowledge the wisdom of Yahovah's way of life, and they choose to also be governed by Yahovah, then they too will walk in his ways. So the knowledge of Torah is not isolated to Israel alone. It is really spread throughout the earth. But this does raise several questions. Number one, if God is to govern the nations, what type of government will he install? How will God differentiate between the nation of Israel and other nations such as Egypt, Europe, America, Russia? How will that relationship work? Micah was one of the first prophets to foretell of God's salvation for all people. And I alluded to this earlier, but in Micah 4, verses 1 through 9, the prophet tells us that not only will Yahweh teach Israel his ways and his law, but his law, his Torah, will go out from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. And turn with me to Micah chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. And we are actually going to go ahead and read this entire verse or this entire section of text. It says, "But in the last days it will come to pass that the mountain of the house of Yahweh shall be established in the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people will flow to it. And many nations shall come and say, let us go up to the house, to the mountain of Yahweh, and to the house of the God of Jacob. For he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his path. For a law shall go out of Zion, and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem." So notice, this is not just Israel coming to the house of Yahweh and wanting to know and learn the ways of Yahweh. This is the nations of the earth wanting to come and learn the ways of Yahweh, wanting to know the word of Yahweh. In verse 3, "And he shall judge among the people and rebuke nations afar off, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the mouth of Yahweh has spoken it." So this idea of every man living under his own vine and his own fig tree, it conveys the idea of peace and prosperity, but not just peace and prosperity for Israel, but for all nations. Notice in this text of this future world where there is peace and there is harmony, and nations no longer invest economically in war or invest their people into war. There is no idea of all nations becoming this one huge conglomerate nation of Israel. Each nation sits under its own vine and under its own fig tree, and each nation retains its own national identity. So the only thing that joins these nations together, that produces this peace and harmony in the world, is the way of Yahweh. It is the ideas and the concepts of Torah that are able to transcend nations and affect God's salvation among all nations of the earth. So how will nations be converted to love the peace of Israel's God? How will they be converted to lay down their weapons and to no longer fight with their fellow countrymen? Well, I think David really touches on this in Psalms 119, verse 155, when he tells us that the path to peace, the way of salvation, is once again contained within the Torah. Psalms 119, verse 165, David states, "Great peace have all they that love your Torah. Nothing shall offend them. Yahweh, I have hoped for your salvation. I have done your commandments, your mitzvah. My soul hath kept your testimony, your adah, and I love them exceedingly. For I have kept your precepts and your testimonies, your adah, for all my ways are before you." We find that the Torah of Yahweh is what produces peace and salvation. But how do the nations of the earth, how do they have access to it? Well, it actually comes by following the same pattern that Israel has followed, by remembering what God has done, remembering what God has done with the ancient nation of Israel. And then when the nations see the restoration of the modern nation of Israel. And this is key. This is what David tells us in Psalm 62, verses 2 through 7. He tells us that when the nations remember, when the way of Yahweh is known throughout the earth, God's saving health will be revealed to all nations. Now, the term there that is used for saving health is actually the word Yeshua, meaning salvation for the earth. And let's go ahead and read all of Psalm 62, and we're going to read verses 2 through 7. David says, that your way may be known upon the earth, and your salvation among all nations. Let the people praise you, O God, and let the people praise you. Oh, let the nations be glad and sing for joy, for you will judge the people righteously and govern the nations of the earth. Let the people praise you, O God, and let the people praise you. Then shall the earth yield her increase, and God, even our own God, shall bless us. And God shall bless us, and the ends of the earth will fear him. So this is a salvation that is not just for Israel. It is a salvation that is for all people. Israel is simply God's firstborn son, the first to come to the light of that salvation, the first to walk in it. But we really become ambassadors for the Torah, ambassadors for disseminating this truth with others beyond ourselves and beyond those that believe like us and those that we would consider our neighbors or our fellow constituents. We find that other nations will be convicted based on Israel's history, based on the righteousness. You know, when Israel comes to live without the doublethink, when Israel does not embrace a philosophy, a doctrine that has within it self-contradiction, she then has the power to stand up and righteously speak God's truth to the nations. So, with speaking God's truth to the nations and disseminating above it among all people, how will the nations finally desire peace? Well, we find that this peace and prosperity is spread through the world by once again sharing the knowledge within the Torah. Isaiah verses 2 through 4 really quotes from Micah. Micah had lived before Isaiah, and Isaiah simply quotes from his predecessor and builds on his prophecy. And Isaiah, let's just go ahead and read this because I want to reiterate this concept of a law going out from Zion, and a law that is for all nations. This is what Isaiah says, and it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of Yahweh's house shall be established on the top of mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. And many people will go and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of Yahovah, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth a law, and the word of Yahovah from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among the nations and rebuke many people. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of Yahovah. The key to this peace among all nations today, the key to peace in the Middle East, the key between Russia, Afghanistan, the nations of Europe, even the nations of Africa, is walking in the light of the Torah. Now, in discussions that I have had with people, Jews and Christians alike, there is this tendency to believe that this Torah that goes forth out of Jerusalem at some future time in Israel's history will be drastically different than the Torah God gave to Israel at Mount Sinai some 3,000 years ago. But is this what Scripture teaches? Now, the justification for the idea that this Torah will be different is usually cited by Jeremiah 31. They will refer to Jeremiah 31 as showing that, hey, look, it's a different law, it's a different Torah that goes out of Jerusalem. But you really have to pay attention to the exact words that are used because that is not exactly what the text is saying. So let's pay very close attention to what Jeremiah states in Jeremiah 31:33. Notice that what is given to Israel and what changes is the type of covenant, the adah that changes. The law itself remains intact. In other words, the words of Yahweh, the words of life, his philosophy, his way of life remain intact and do not change. This is what Jeremiah 31, verses 33 through 34 states. It says, "But this shall be the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Yahweh. I will put my law in their inward parts. I will write it in their hearts, and they will be my people. And they shall teach no more each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, Know Yahweh, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, says Yahweh. I will forgive their sins, and I will remember their sins no more." So when God says that he will make a new covenant, not like the covenant that he made with Israel's ancestors, he isn't changing the law, he's changing the adah, the type of covenant that he made with Israel. The law remains the same, but it is a law that he writes on our very heart. And how does he write it on our heart? Well, I think that comes through studying the Torah, from seeing what the Torah actually says, its exact provisions, and coming to understand for ourselves the wisdom and the justice, the righteousness of what God has prescribed for us. And this is how I believe God's healing salvation will indeed be disseminated to all the nations of the earth. Notice that it is this law that is written on our hearts, and this law that goes out from Jerusalem that the nations will one day desire to know. Now, I know that a lot of people still have this tendency to think that this future law is really different than the concepts and the philosophies that were given at Sinai. And I don't think that there is a love among all people for the ancient Torah. But we find that even Isaiah, if you turn to Isaiah 40, verses 7 and 8, when we talk about the word of Yahweh, we find that it is something that is eternal, something that is unchanging, and something that stands forever. Isaiah says, "The grass withers, the flower fades, because the spirit of Yahweh blows upon it, and surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of Yahweh shall stand forever." The word that God spoke at Sinai, the word that he spoke to Israel on the plains of Moab, is eternal. It stands forever. The ideas of right and wrong don't change just simply because God has applied all the curses of the law that he enumerated in Deuteronomy 28 and Deuteronomy 29. Just because God upheld his word, he placed those curses on the nation of Israel. And even if those curses overflowed and affected all nations of the earth, all that is God keeping his promises, God doing and applying the judgments that he said he would do. It is God being faithful to his word and God upholding that. But within this, within God upholding his word and God fulfilling his word, it in no way means that God's promises, that his ideas of right and wrong, that his ideas of morality or justice have been fulfilled or pass away or are done away with in any way. In fact, we find that it is these statutes of life that are able to bring salvation both to Israel and all nations of the earth. It brings salvation both in foreign policy as well as in domestic policy. The Torah really transcends the nation of Israel. So it goes beyond Israel's borders in being able to affect peace and harmony throughout the nations of the earth, and really in bringing about a place where nations no longer want to fight against each other. So I wanted to establish in the first part of this study the idea that the Torah is for all nations of the earth and not just Israel. But now I want to get into some specifics, specifics that have to do with the Torah's stance on both domestic and international policy. We're going to look at this first from a domestic standpoint for ancient Israel and what that domestic policy meant for the ancient nation of Israel. From there, we're going to look at federal policy within the nation of Israel, then go down and look at how it would be applied at the local, state, or community level for Israel's society, and then see how this could enlighten and provide salvation for the nations of the earth today. So we're going to begin, like I said, with domestic national policy within the borders of Israel. The first thing that we find is that God establishes clear national borders for the nation of Israel. In Genesis 15, God gives a specific territory of land to Abraham and his descendants, a homeland for his children. In Numbers 34, God establishes clear national borders. He goes through very, very painstaking detail to make sure that Israel's borders are clearly delineated. Those borders did not belong to Israel's enemies. Those borders, beyond those borders, were not Israel's, and within those borders did not belong to other nations. So Israel really was not a borderless nation, nor is there a concept that Israel will one day become a nation that will dominate the world or that will fill the world. Rather, we find there is a very specific inheritance for Israel that extends from the river Euphrates to the border of Egypt. And this is the territory of land given to the nation of Israel. In a modern context, it is very important for all nations of the earth to have clearly distinguished national borders. That is a sovereign right, not just for the ancient nation of Israel, but for modern nations today. And we find in Scripture that in this future period of restoration, that God also acknowledges national borders in the future. In fact, in Isaiah 19:23, God recognizes that Egypt will still have borders for its nation at a point in time where Egypt also learns to walk righteously before Yahweh. Let's look at Isaiah 19:23. At a point in time where God says that Egypt and her people will become a blessing in the earth. Isaiah 19, verse 19 states, "In that day shall there be an altar to Yahweh in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar in the border thereof." So God recognizes Egypt's sovereignty as a separate state from Israel's, and there is no quest to unite Israel with Egypt, but rather to make each nation peaceably live with each other. Now, God continues to describe how both he will judge Israel and how he will heal Israel in the future. Continuing in verse 20, says, "And this shall be for a sign, for a witness for Yahweh of hosts in the land of Egypt. For they shall cry unto Yahweh because of their oppressors, and he shall send them a Savior and a great one, and he shall deliver them. And Yahweh shall be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians shall know Yahweh in that day, and do sacrifice and oblation. Yes, they will vow a vow to Yahweh and perform it. And Yahweh will smite Egypt, and he will heal it. And they shall return to Yahweh. And Yahweh shall be, and he shall be entreated of them, and he shall heal them. And in that day there shall be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians shall serve with the Assyrians." Verses 24, "And in that day shall Israel be a third with Egypt and Assyria, even a blessing in the midst of the land. Whom Yahweh shall bless, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria the work of mine hands, and Israel mine inheritance." that in the future, Israel is only one part of the blessing in the land. Egypt and Assyria are, it appears, equal blessings. But how can Assyria or Egypt become a blessing if they are not walking in the way of Yahweh? If they are oppressing or violating human rights, if they are oppressing and subjugating their own people through heavy-handed government policies, they cannot be a blessing in the earth. The blessing for them comes from establishing the policies set forth in Torah and holding themselves accountable to the ideas within Torah. In Isaiah 19:22, the word used to turn to Yahovah, Yeshub, is once again the same word used in Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 and 2, and Psalms 22, verse 27. For when Israel returned to Yahovah, it is also stated that Egypt will also turn to Yahovah, and it appears walk in his ways. But once again, when the nations become righteous, when they seek Yahovah, there is no concept of an Israelite nation that consumes and overflows the entire nations of the world. But we find that there are very separate entities and very separate nations, but that those nations are able to peaceably coexist with Israel and with all the other nations of the earth. The second policy we're going to look at is the idea of a national homeland. Now, Israel is a little bit different in this policy in that the specific borders for Israel, that would be from the river Euphrates to the Pelusic branch of the Nile in Egypt, are specifically given to Israel as an inheritance and to no other nation of the earth. And there is a reason for this. And this reason really comes down to the words and the prophecy that Noah spoke. Noah, in Genesis 9, there is some incident that happens whereby Noah removes a birthright from Ham's son or grandson, Canaan. And he takes that birthright and he gives it to his firstborn son, Shem. And Shem, therefore, has a double blessing. Shem is now not only Noah's firstborn son and has a double blessing, but it appears that this idea of birthright and blessing then is passed on through Shem's descendants. Abraham is Shem's firstborn son. If you'll read through the patriarchal narrative, it talks about Abraham being a prince and a prince in the land of Canaan. Well, this is actually a reality. It's a realistic description of Abraham because as Shem's firstborn son, Shem would have been a prince to the house of Shem, and he would have carried that birthright and blessing. This is why God extends it to Abraham and offers him the right to claim his inheritance, to claim the land of Canaan that Noah had taken away from Shem, and that is now being bequeathed to Abraham and his descendants. So God gives very specific boundaries and a very specific territory in Genesis 15, verses 18 through 20. This includes the lands of the Kenites, the Kezanites, the Kadamites, the Hittites, Pezerites, Raphims, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. And God states in Genesis 15, verse 18, he says, I have given you this land from the river Euphrates unto the great river and the river of Egypt. So this is a specific territory of land that God gives to Israel. And he gives it to them in order to secure a peaceful homeland. And he also commands them to drive out the native inhabitants, the tribes that are specifically mentioned in Genesis 15. Now, notice that even though God establishes this idea for a homeland, there is no idea of anywhere in the Tanakh of Israel dominating the entire world, but it is rather this idea of the world coming into the knowledge of Yahweh and walking in his ways. But this idea of a national homeland is a right. It is a privilege that every nation of the earth has a right and a claim to. Although Israel's homeland is established through the covenant with God, other nations such as Egypt, other nations such as France or the UK, America, every nation has a right to its own homeland. And this is something that should be honored and recognized. For Israel, God gave them very specific policies to follow in securing a homeland so that they could live peaceably within their own homeland without the threat of domestic terrorism. Some of those policies, including driving out the native inhabitants. It included not making covenants or treaties with the inhabitants' natives, and also not intermarrying with them. And the reason that God gives these policies is because the native inhabitants could pull Israel away and could weaken her heart and her solitude and her fortitude in walking in the way of Yahweh. So the next policy we're going to look at is the idea of conquering one's homeland. And again, this idea, even though it is given to Israel and it applies specifically to the land of Canaan, the general idea applies to modern nations today. Because if a people were to have a homeland and coexist with native inhabitants, you find that there is usually conflict, civil conflict that erupts, and civil conflict that continues to erupt generations down the line because there is a process of doublethink, and not just doublethink, but outright conflict between what one group believes should be a national law and what another group believes should be a national law. So most of us today really want this utopic society that Micah and Isaiah refer to, this idea where nations do not war against nations. But we find that even for ancient Israel, there were certain things ancient Israel had to do in order to achieve peace within its own statehood. So we can't put the cart before the horse. One nation cannot exist with two competing philosophical ideas for a national constitution or a national system of justice. Sharia cannot coexist with modern ideas of republic or even within the ideals of Torah. Many of the statutes, judgments, and laws within the Torah openly conflict the values and the standards of Sharia law. So these ideas are not compatible in any way. So to ensure peace in the future, God gave Israel very specific steps anciently to secure its homeland and to make it a peaceful nation. In Numbers 33, verses 51 through 54, God gives Israel very specific steps for securing its borders and living peaceably. This is God's command. He says through Moses, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you are passed over Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you. You shall destroy all their pictures and destroy their molten images and quite pluck down their high places. And you shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land and dwell therein. For I have given you the land to possess it. And you shall divide the land by a lot for an inheritance among your families. To the more you shall give more of an inheritance, and to the fewer you shall give less of an inheritance. Every man's inheritance shall be in the place where his lot falls. According to the tribes of Israel of your fathers shall you inherit." So there is this idea of effacing the memory of the natives of the land. And this one, I will admit, is a hard one for me as a historian who loves the idea that we can reclaim the memory of a people, memory of a society, by digging in the ground and unearthing artifacts. But we also see especially today in the modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that artifacts that are dug up from the land are often used to justify one's claim to the land. The fact that we have Hebrew inscriptions going back 2,500 years ago, the fact that Jerusalem is mentioned in the 6th century BCE justifies Israel's claim to the land. But by the same token, because we do not have the epigraphs of other nations and the fact that there is not their claim to the land of Israel, that does indeed help the modern state and the modern Hebrews' claim to the land. But it is often used in a context where even modernly nations should secure their rights to their own homelands. So, in a modern context, there is a lot of controversy over even America's right to the land of the Native Americans. And the means by which were not always righteous. In many cases, they were very subversive, by which the early Americans subjugated and claimed America as a land for the European settlers. So even though these are done often subversively, and it is not always done with the best methods, or it's not always done righteously, driving out the native inhabitants is the key to any nation, whether it be ancient Israel, America, or any European nation, eventually securing a homeland and living and prospering. Now, let me take a moment to address the issue of ISIS, or say a Palestinian state. ISIS differs drastically in the fact that they are not seeking a homeland for their own people. Rather, they are seeking a caliphate that will dominate the world, all peoples and societies. That is drastically different. There is the question as to whether or not the Palestinians should be allowed their own state. Well, the Arab Palestinians should be allowed their own state, but not within the borders of Israel that are specifically given to the nation of Israel. There are plenty of other lands and plenty of other territories where that can take place. What you find that the paradigm is in scripture is that if those nations continue to seek oppressive ways that oppress their own people, ways that are contrary to the way of Yahweh, he will take all the curses that had been on Israel and he will apply them to other nations until those nations also learn to walk in peace and harmony. Now, I have heard a lot of times in discussions regarding God's subjugation policy of the Canaanites that it was not a righteous way, that what God told Israel to do in regard to the Canaanites was something that, a dark time in Israel's history, and kind of this idea of doublethink, where we're not going to acknowledge that, well, there may be some truth and some wisdom to this policy. But rather we're going to think of it as something that is good. But notice what scripture says regarding the Canaanites. When God originally gave his covenant to Abraham, when he originally promised that specific territory of land to Abraham's descendants, he told Abraham that he couldn't give it to him at that point in time. He could not yet give the land of Israel, or the land of Canaan rather, to Abraham's descendants, because, as he states in Genesis 15, verse 16, the sins of the Amorites had not come to the full. So we have this idea that nations are not allowed to be subdued. Nations are not allowed to be conquered unless their sins have come into the full. In Leviticus 18, verses 24, it really enlightens us about the types of sins that had come into the full for the Amorites, and the type of immorality and degradation to which Canaan had succumbed. This is what God tells us in Leviticus 18, verse 24. God says, defile not yourselves in any of these things, and what is previously spoken is the morality code. For in all these things are that defiled the nations which I cast out before you. And the land is defiled, therefore do I visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomits out her inhabitants. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation, nor any stranger that sojourns among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled, that the land spew you not out when you defile it, as it is spewed out the nations that were before you. So the Canaanites were not innocent. They sacrificed their children to other deities. They were oppressive in their obligations to the state, and oppressive in their obligations to the priesthood as represented by the state. Not only did the priesthood often take private property, the priesthood often required acts and service to the deity. And those not only endangered society, it also endangered the health and the fabric of society in general. So society was not innocent when God commanded Israel to drive them out of the land. The same for Israel. When God brought in the Assyrians or the Babylonians to drive Israel out of the land, it was once again for their own sins and for their own iniquities. You see this in many nations throughout the earth that are conquered and subdued many times because of their own sins and their own way of life that allows that to happen. Now, Israel's subjugation policy also allowed for peace to be extended to the people who lived in Canaan. This was not just whole out conquering the land. In Deuteronomy 20, verses 10 through 20, God also allowed suzerainty treaties to be offered to cities that opened peaceably. Now, the nations that were specifically identified in Genesis 15 were not allowed, and they were not part of this, but other people who had immigrated into the land of Canaan, if they opened peaceably to Israel at the time of the conquest, if they were willing to live under Israel as a tributary, and if they were willing to assimilate with Israel, they were allowed to live in the land and to prosper. So this, again, was not a whole out conquering of the land where everyone was driven out. It did indeed allow for those people who would be peaceful with Israel and who were willing to live under one nation and under one set of laws. But the reason that God gives us, the reason that God tells us he wanted Israel to drive out all the natives of the land is found in Deuteronomy 20, verse 18. This comes at the very end of the policy that God enumerates for cleansing the land and for allowing Israel to live in a peaceful homeland. And that reason is this. In Deuteronomy 20, verse 18, God says that they teach you not to do after all their abominations which they have done to their gods, that you should sin against Jehovah. So the idea of Israel driving out the natives was so that they did not pervert their ideology and their philosophy. So they didn't pull on their heartstrings, asking for compassion when that compassion would be a snare to Israel. Solomon says that to everything there is a time and a place and a season. So there is a time for compassion, there is a time for peace, but within the confines of your own homeland, you have to establish the structure of that government first so that peace can indeed follow. For ancient Israel and her history, when God commands us to remember, when he commands us to remember what Israel had done and what he had done for Israel, you find that David follows this idea of remembrance in Psalms 106. And he remembers that Israel never did drive out the nations whom God specifically commanded Israel to drive out. He remembers that that Israel were reluctant to follow God's commands, and he remembers how God laments Israel's hesitance at following his instructions. Um, Turn with me to Psalms 108, verses 32 through 33, 32 through 43. And we're going to look at what David states regarding Israel's reluctance to follow Yahweh's instructions regarding its domestic policy towards its own homeland. It says, they angered him also at the waters of strife, so that it went ill with Moses for their sakes, because they provoked his spirit, so that he spake unadvisedly with his lips. They did not destroy the nations concerning whom God had commanded them, but they were mingled among the heathen and learned their works. And they sacrificed to idols, which were a snare to them. Yes, they sacrificed their sons and their daughters to devils. They shed innocent blood, even the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sanctified unto the idols of Canaan. And the land was polluted with blood. Thus they were defiled with their own works, and were whoring with their own inventions. There was wrath of Yahweh kindled against his people, insomuch that he abhorred his own inheritance. And he gave them into the hand of the heathen, and they that hated them ruled over them. Their enemies also oppressed them, and they were brought into subjugation under their hand. Many times he did seek to deliver them, but they provoked him with their counsel, and they were brought low for their iniquity. So notice this idea that because Israel did not drive out the inhabitants of the land as God first told them to, that those who remained in the land not only became thorns and briars, as Deuteronomy 33 verses 54 state would happen, but those that they allowed to remain in the land ended up becoming the very entities that subjugated Israel. This was especially true throughout the Judges era, but it's also true at the latter term of the monarchy, when it states, I believe, in Chronicles, that the Amorites, that many of the Canaanites, the Edomites began to raid Judah, and they began to take the people of Israel and Judah and subjugate them and bring them back to their own homelands. So when we don't follow God's policy, it may not have immediate implications. It may not occur in our own lifetimes, but there is an ebbing and changing of tide where the philosophies of those who do not love and share a love for Torah and the philosophy of Torah, of freedom and of judgment and of justice, that on down the line, generations later, it can turn against us, and people, communities that were once peaceful can then be turned to hate God's people because they walk by a different way of life. Now, this idea of conquest, this idea of securing Israel's homeland is not just part of Israel's past. Isaiah tells us that it will once again become part of Israel's future at the latter day restoration. Isaiah 11, verses 11 through 14, talks of a day where God will set out again to restore Israel to their tribal borders. He will remember his covenant. And when he remembers his covenant, he will seek to once again establish Abraham's seed, the seed of Jacob, on the promised land. And this is what Isaiah 11, verses 11 through 14, this is what Isaiah states. And it will come to pass in that day that Jehovah shall set his hand again a second time to recover the remnant of his people, which be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the islands in the sea. And he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and he shall assemble the outcasts of Judah, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. The envy of Ephraim shall depart, and the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not vex Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim. But they shall fly on the shoulders of the Philistines towards the west. They shall spoil them of the east together. They shall lay their hand upon Edom and Moab, and the children of Ammon shall obey them. Part of Israel's latter-day inheritance, part of Israel's restoration to the land, is to obey the ancient commands that Israel's forefathers had not, to do what Israel's forefathers were not willing to do. Before peace can spill over towards all the earth, it has to be established firmly within Israel's own borders, where there is no outside or evil occurrent in Israel's land. Isaiah continues this description of restoration in verses 15 through verses 12, verse 1. And this is part of the conquest that Israel will perform in the future. It says, and Yahweh shall utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea. With his mighty wind shall he shake his hand over the river, and he shall smite the seven streams and make men go over dry shod. And there shall be a highway for the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, like as it were in the day when Israel came up out of the land of Egypt. And in that day shall they say, O Yahweh, I will praise you. Though you were angry with me, your anger is turned away, and you comforted me. So this comes about through the process of remembering Yahweh. And we can't live in a world of doublethink, or we can, but it is a world full of self-contradiction that will not lead to the latter-day peace and harmony that God has in store for us. If we put the cart before the horse, where we try to achieve utopia without following the specific commands that God takes, the process that he tells us it takes to get there, we will never achieve and realize a state or a world where nations no longer make war against nations. Today, Arab Palestinians living and coexisting within the state of Israel are used as vehicles to bring terror to the land. They are also used as political levies where they can affect policy change and where they can do harm to the modern state of Israel. But to follow Yahweh's instructions will require a change in policy. It will require a change in attitude, both among those that support Israel, but also among those that love Torah and that seek the way of Yahweh. To affect a world that will eventually live in peace, where nation will not rise up against nation, and where we do not live in self-contradiction, it requires several steps. It requires remembering Yahweh. It requires remembering his Torah. And this is not just relevant to Israel's past, but this is also relevant to the past of all nations of the earth, because when Israel begins to remember, when Israel begins to affect this policy, and when we begin to walk in the light of Yahweh and we begin to be ambassadors of this light, we can begin the healing process. We can begin the dissemination of knowledge and policies that will bring about this needed change, where nations no longer rise up against nations. It is only then that Israel and the world can begin this healing process, where God's healing salvation is extended to all nations of the earth, and where Israel is only one nation among many that become the people of Jehovah. Now, next week, we are going to look at many other questions. We are going to look at what Israel's role is in the future, what Israel's role is in the future of all nations. How does Israel's inheritance differ from all the nations of the earth. We're also going to look at the other policies God establishes, domestic policies such as welfare, immigration, as well as other ideas that will affect peace and harmony for not only Israel, but the nations of the earth. Please join me again next week, and Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.
Okay.
Thank you guys for sticking with us this morning. And I've got to just give a hands off to Dave, who stuck with us and just did not give up and, got us online. So, woo-hoo-hoo. Thank you, Dave.
Didn't do it. It fixed itself.
Yeah, it's really weird, Now, of course, I do have to do a disclaimer. The whole Google Hangouts issue could just be me. There are some times when, because I use Google Hangouts, and
Not saying anything.
and there are some evenings where I will get onto Hangouts, and there is nothing I can do. If it has a mind of its own, yeah, it malfunctions, and there is just nothing I can do.
That's what I did this morning. It does when we push to go live, it does a readout, 5%, 10%, all the way around. This morning it got to 99%, just stops.
Right.
No matter what we did, tried to go around it several times. Finally, let's try one more time, and it worked. So we can do anything. Oh, turn you.
Yes, I just paused it. I just want to make sure we were there.
And you probably don't have, if you want.
I do have chat.
You have all the history of chat though?
I do not have the history.
Well, here, you want to swap, or
Okay.
you don't have to swap. You don't have to give me that one.
Okay.
But you can see some of the. I don't need to see it.
Okay.
It's a touch screen, so you can.
Okay, just go up
And
and
you
down.
can actually get it bigger. Yeah, just go up and down. You can go all the way from the time you started. And while you're doing that, you just want to see some questions. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's some good comments about this, and we're going to do like a 20-minute discussion here.
Yeah, 20-minute discussion. We had a late start today, and I'm sure people want to have lunch, and I'm sure Dave wants to.
Yeah, I need to take a break
today.
I need to take a break. I've got to take my nap.
Mm-hmm.
My question resolved around probably the most controversial thing you said was around the idea of, let's see how I can word this, of other nations. Where's it at? Let me find the notes. It was towards the end of your first part.
Okay.
There were some other ideas too.
Other nations being saved, and salvation not just for Israel.
Something like that, something along that line, and it'll come to me. And I beg my pardon there. I didn't write it down.
That's all right.
Because I got notes. You bring notes.
Yeah, and then it.
And I couldn't follow. Otherwise, I'd have never followed it. As far as trying to type in the people, the scripture notations. It had to do. My question had to do with how. Okay, I remember something.
Okay.
The new covenant that is written in our heart. That's where it goes to. And there was a controversy about whether this is a new Torah or not. Right. That idea. Do you want to get into that?
Sure.
Because I'm not going to go deep. I'm not a deep person.
Okay.
I'm not really that
I haven't come across any questions yet.
Yeah.
Guys, if
I'll find it.
And if you have questions, please feel free to retype your questions, or if you have comments, please feel free to retype it. And somehow
there was a lot of good responses. The Torah being brought to many other nations via the diaspora.
Absolutely. That's a great.
Patty, had a lot of conversation on that. All the families of the earth will be blessed.
That's right.
Me and Dave Tyler were talking a little bit about the Christian Bible. In other words, we kind of got this. There was a discussion of without the Christian Bible, it was kind of like an ark that carried the Torah to the nations. And I made a comment off cuff, so to speak, like, yeah, but it had a lot of baggage. that ark had a lot of baggage to it. But we have to remember where we came from. The children of Israel had to remember that they were slaves. We have to remember that we were once Christian.
Yeah. Well, I will say that I know there's a lot of different views and relationships to that Christian heritage.
Yeah.
I treasure that.
And different Christian ideas too.
Different Christian ideas.
Southern Baptist and what you were involved with, totally different.
Totally different. But I really think that remembering our past,
the
good, the bad, and the ugly,
no matter what
all of that past,
the path we walked.
it is a way for us to take an honest look at ourselves, for us to see the things that work, to challenge the things that didn't work. And I believe it provides healing in that process.
Yeah.
So I
totally
very
agree
much
with
treasure that past.
So many times, and I know you've seen it, and you probably experienced it because I've seen it and I've done it myself. When we first started coming into this Torah idea, we get mad at Christianity and we really bomb them. Bam, man, no good. It's nothing. It's not even worth reading, and so on and so forth. So, I've had to backpedal and lighten that statement to a little bit. And Dave Tyler, to his credit, has straightened me out several times. Yeah.
Good old Dave.
Yeah. And he was Catholic. He was raised Catholic, so it's a totally different thing also.
Yeah, totally different.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get into the controversy. Jeremiah 31. That's where it says, not like, let's see, I'm going down to.
Not like the other covenant, which I gave you in Mount Sinai. There's something where if I had to word it right.
Okay, Jeremiah 31, verse 32, this is what it says. Behold, the days come, saith Yahweh, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them out of the hand, took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was a husband to them.
Wow.
So, covenant.
Yeah.
So we have to get our terminology right.
Okay, that would make a lot of sense. That would make a lot of sense because you're a biggie on the covenant.
Yes.
And I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna argue with you on that one. So go ahead.
So the covenant is a contractual relationship. So if I am going to go into business with you,
it's a legal thing. Yeah.
Say for instance, I am going to adopt you. Okay, you're going to be my son.
Well, you're going to. Well,
okay. Or say you have a kid. Okay, you're not able to raise your kid, and I am going to adopt that child. Okay. Well, I'm going to go into a covenant, and I'm going to make an agreement with you regarding this relationship.
Okay.
I will be a parent to this child, to your child. I will do all of these things, but there's certain stipulations. Number one, you're going to have to recognize that whatever I say for this child will take precedence.
I got you.
If I decide this child should go to school, it should have an education, if I make all these decisions, you're going to have to realize that's my right. In most adoption cases, you're going to give up many of your parental rights because now mine supersede.
Okay.
Because now you're transferring your role as parent from yourself to me. Similar to Israel, when God made a covenant with them, it was a contractual relationship that he would be their deity and that he would be his people, kind of almost a parent-child relationship. In this relationship, God makes certain stipulations. Obey my covenant. The covenant itself, the stipulations were the 10 Commandments, or rather I hate really the phrase 10 Commandments because it's more 10 categories.
Because that's the problem that I have with what you're saying. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong or right, because I think we're well above that. But the idea of what was added later and what's really authentic.
Exactly. And you get into all those controversies. Yeah. What I have found
in the oral stuff.
Right. The oral stuff is a whole nother topic.
Okay.
When you look at what the covenant was.
Okay.
And you look at the covenant that God made with Israel. You find that when he says he will make a new covenant, the type of covenant that God says he will offer to Israel is a covenant of light. The covenant of light are specific covenants that were offered to David, and they were offered to Phineas. They were also offered to the two women nurses in Egypt in Exodus 3, Panua and Ruah. I don't exactly remember the names right now.
Right.
But who?
See, because that's my other point. I feel like I have the Torah in my heart. Right. And I don't remember that exact name. So, you could argue there. You said, exactly. Name that exactly. It's the Torah. So go ahead.
Right. So you find that what God offered to David, Phineas, and these two women are different from the type of contract that he offered to Israel, the type of
Okay.
covenant that he made with
Okay.
Israel.
An
A
agreement.
covenant of
An
light
agreement.
does not have all the curses associated with it that Israel's covenant did.
Okay.
So the main feature of the covenant that will be changed when a new covenant is issued will be the curses that are enumerated in the law. Now, in my research and my study, I have found that the curses of the law form a chronological prophecy that God specifically applied to Israel in their history. It's been fulfilled, so it's no longer applicable. Once he returns to
Not
Israel,
that it's gone away. It's just
it's in Israel's
it's
past.
no longer in operation. So
right. Well, Israel's already been deported from the land.
Yeah.
Israel's already been conquered by a nation from afar. You will eat your sons and your daughters by way of the straits. All of that's been fulfilled, and that's in Israel's past. So that leaves what's in Israel's future, and that will be a new covenant. It will have different consequences. It may not even have a very broad consequence, because Jehovah states, he says, this will be, speaking specifically of diaspora, he says, this will be like the waters of Noah to me. So never again will any of Israel's covenants ever contain the idea of diaspora.
Wow.
Because God is sanctioning that. He is, what's the word? Not condemning it, but he's making it as just like a flood that will consume the earth. And he says, this will never happen again.
I got you. Okay.
So also will the concept of diaspora be banished. It will never occur again, specifically for the nation of Israel. So there are specific things that when you look through what the prophets tell us this new covenant will look like, Israel will be given a new name. That's also in the covenant. It will probably incorporate some fashion or facet of the name of Israel, a new name, but diaspora will not be part of that covenant.
Right. Okay. So I'll follow that. I follow that. What has been has been. God doesn't change. The idea that it's not going to be a covenant that's just totally different. It's totally out of there. It's still going to even have God's word in your heart. Your point was you have to study the Torah as we have it now. You have to know it. Right. It's not going to magically appear in your heart. Right. I'm thinking that. And to counter that, though, I'd like to say that it's kind of like boiling water. If the old pot, the idea of the pot in the boiling water, and it brings up the heat slowly. I have an idea that this Torah that's going to be in our hearts is going to come in. It's going to creep into a point where we don't really say off on. Right. It's going to be cycling into our being.
Well, I think it's like anything else we do. I mean, as a society, we know how to drive a car. We know how to work a computer. But how did that occur? Well, that occurred. Right. It's
taken a long time for me and Jodell. We still have to figure it out.
Or working an iPhone. That took a couple years. Yeah. I see
or the timer on the VCR never happened.
Okay, some things are just beyond human control. But I think the Torah is the same way, where it's a process of education, and it being in our heart and becoming a part of us. It's that education, and when we gain the wisdom and the understanding of the whys and the hows, that is what enables the love.
Eventually, to a point where not just to mention the pruning shears and stuff, but the idea of no man saying to his neighbor, "Know the Lord," because they'll all know the Lord. Right. That's, to me, that's. I mean, I like the idea of not remembering war anymore. Don't teach your children anymore. But the idea of not teaching your neighbor,
not having to explain the name,
not having to explain a lot of stuff. It's like, okay,
we all get it.
Putting you teachers out of business.
Hey, I'm all for that. We'll go sunbathe in Hawaii somewhere.
Yeah, and I have to counter that with the idea. And I've talked with Ross about this. And I'm not saying that you're studying your capabilities that you've learned through your what's the word, discipline of studying and stuff's not going to go away. We're still going to need experts and scholars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you find
we
that
still are.
Yeah, well, even in righteous periods, you still have people, leaders of the people,
Sure.
and not to say that we're leaders or anything like
I got
that,
you. I got you.
but you still find that, say, take within the clans of Judah, you still have that there are princes of the people. There's still governance. It's not like government goes away and we just kumbaya and we magically get along with each other. No, even in a righteous,
I didn't know where you were going with that. What kind of government is the world going to have?
Well, I think it will look a lot like what God gave to Israel.
With the fear of Islamic stuff going on, ruling of the world in our present time. One world government doesn't have a good name.
No. Well, and I don't see. Let me clarify. I do not see a one world government.
I got you.
What I do see is each nation becoming righteous in their own accord.
Some more than others, maybe.
Some more than others. If you look at Deuteronomy 30, verse 7, God says that he will take all the curses that were on Israel. He'll place them on all the other nations. And the idea is that they are under those curses until they also become obedient.
So there's some responsibility there.
Absolutely.
I got you. That's heartening, to know that. I mean, I know that, if I have friends or a group of people and we're entering into some kind of deal, and we're all wanting to be treated fairly, and but if you have different rules,
that's right.
And so it gets crazy, and but that's the gist of it. The idea of the old, out with the old, in with the new, and your point is not so much out with the old here.
Well, right.
The old ways, baby.
Exactly. If Isaiah says,
but the Torah's not going to change,
that the grass withers and that the people is grass, so we fade.
Yeah.
We come and go. One generation passes away, another one comes to it. Every generation has new ideas. We're all wanting to reinvent the wheel. Somehow our generation has something our forefathers missed. But Isaiah says that, okay, you guys, you can think this all you want. You can always think there's something new under the sun. Generations come and go. It fades away. But what is it that is eternal? The word of Yahweh stands forever.
Wow. And
he spoke his word at Sinai. He audibly spoke that word. And Moses received that word. His prophets received that word. So it is that word of Yahweh that stands forever.
If we're ever going to have flying cars, we got to start.
Yeah, start small beginnings.
We got to do something. You can't just wait for the flying cars to appear. Yeah. We have to make the flying cars.
We have to engineer it. Yeah. So Miriam says, Jeremiah 31:33, I will put my law within them. Could this also be in line with the statement, eyes being open? Absolutely, sure. Miriam. Sure. The process of opening of the eyes is an understanding. It is a process by which, this is also interesting. When God states that, and let me get this verse real quick. My mouse is not, there it is. I had to go find my mouse. The process of knowledge and understanding is not just with Israel, it's really with all nations. And it really does, because Israel does not live in a vacuum.
Nor can they do that themselves on their own back. It would, every nation has to be responsible for themselves. And I like the idea that, and while you're looking at that in your words, maybe I can, the nations have to look at Israel. Israel has to have it right. United Israel World Union.
That's right.
They have to get it right. That begs the question: do you think that Israel's ever going to just get it perfectly right? I mean, are they always going to have problems? Because there's problems with everybody. Everybody has. You can narrow it down to individuals. We all have issues.
Well, I do not yet see the state of Israel as being a Torah observant state. Okay. It's there in various ways.
Kind of goes with your idea of what government is the world, or each nation should have. Because I'm not going to say what government the world should have, because that's not going to happen.
Right. No, that's not going to happen. No, what you find is
That's
that
an example.
it's more of a confederacy. Each nation operates as its own sovereignty.
Sure.
But and here's the thing too.
And they're not going to have any war. That's cool.
The neat thing with what God's plan for salvation is that each nation has its own national sovereignty. They have their own ethnic identity. They have their own customs,
Sure.
their own ways of doing things, but they don't oppress each other. You know, they don't. As a society, they condemn idolatry. They condemn theft. They condemn adultery. They condemn murder. They condemn all of these things. For instance, one change in, say, in Iraq or Iran that I think would occur in the future is that today, when somebody commits murder, they're able to pay a fine and you have a get out of jail card. Right. There is no idea that justice is blind.
Even in this country, that's kind of.
I know. Yeah. It's becoming that way too.
Yeah.
But there is no idea that justice is blind and that the crime itself requires some sort of judgment or atonement. I think that when nations become righteous after Israel, they follow in Israel's footsteps, they'll no longer follow that practice of dia, of accepting the blood.
And I can throw in that, you know, because I like what Ross's teaching is, and it was mine, I think, before Ross was even that God never wanted a king, and so I can say that the world will have one king.
That's right.
They will all know him.
That's right.
So there will be a change there a little bit in the government, so to speak. But I think you're right on with the sovereign. Everybody's sovereign, and people are going to be independent. The nations, the isles, it's all involved. It's not just the dispersed that we're talking about here. It's going to be everybody on this earth is going to know from everybody going to know God, so to speak. That's not to say everybody's going to be following. Everybody's going to be doing the right thing all the time.
Not at all. But what you find the paradigm is that when God places the curses on the nations, and then you have Israel, who is in peace and prosperity. Okay. That really it is, God says that you are a priesthood unto me. The entire nation is a priesthood. So this comes to what is Israel's role in the greater scheme of things. And we're going to get into this a little bit more next week. But you find that Israel, of all the nations of the earth, Israel retains the birthright and the blessing. Okay. So the birthright is a double portion of land. So they'll likely have the land of Israel, and perhaps another land will also be given to them. But you also find that they have the blessing. The blessing specifically refers to leadership. So Israel will have some sort of leadership, a priesthood within the grand scheme of other nations. So
whoever blesses them, he will bless. It's still going to play in play.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. Yeah. And then you find with this idea of priesthood is the idea of
but it's
teaching.
Not forced. None of this is forced.
None of it is forced. Yeah. Well, it may be forced by God, but not by us.
Yeah, but I mean, that's
Right. If you don't obey me, there may be famine. Yeah. There may be different things occurring in different places, but it's more of natural consequence.
Yeah. And forgive me if I scatter my thoughts around too much. The idea that at one point, you touched on it a little bit this morning, that God told the nation of Israel or told the people that to go destroy these people, and they didn't do it. Hopefully the people don't get in their mind that God is telling them to go destroy other people on this earth.
Right, exactly. And that's a very good point, because you have a lot of fanatical groups who will go out and say, well, God showed me, or God told me to go, whatever. The Branch Davidians.
Yeah, there you go.
So specifically.
Many others.
Right, many others. Yeah, and this is why I reiterated, the promise within Scripture is specifically for that territory of land and no other land. Okay. Now, I will say with a caveat, if you have another group of people who need a homeland, say they are oppressed, or say that they need a place where they can live and grow and live according to a constitution.
Immigrants.
Right. Well, there are other places, other homelands, or like Syria, the land of Syria is a land that could sustain people. It is a land that could have secure borders and be able to have a constitution for the people to live freely. Safely, exactly. But it has to be established within that territory of land. And it is those people, it is people within their own homeland. It is their right to establish their own freedom and to take the bull by the horn, so to speak, and to do that for themselves.
That's tell you what, man. I think we hit 20 minutes. Yeah. We're through. We stirred the pot. We got it all going. Now y'all finished it. We opened all these cans of worms. I can't think of anything else except that, next week we're going to be doing.
We are.
I'm going to call it part 2. Is that
yes,
correct?
It is part 2.
And so we're going to do that.
Well, let me bring this up real close.
No,
because,
I'm not.
I got this verse from Marion. Marion had referred to the opening of the eyes. This is, this idea that God says, I will take the blind by a way that they knew not, or this idea that Israel has been in a drunken stupor, or that Israel has been deceived. You find all of these ideas throughout Scripture. But I think what Isaiah says in Isaiah 25 is very, very telling. And this is what God says. He says, and he will destroy in this mountain the face of covering cast over the people, and the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death and victory, and Yahweh will wipe away tears from off all faces, and the rebuke of his people shall he take away from off the face of the earth, for Yahweh has spoken it. Now, part of the rebuke of his people is this concept or this idea of diaspora never again being a part of any covenant that God makes with Israel. Rather, he's going to make a covenant of light with them. But notice that that Isaiah states that the veil of the covering of this veil is across all the nations of the earth. Humankind. So it's not just Israel that lives in deception.
Took away that one right there. Just they're just blind.
It's all nations, but if Israel,
we're just blind.
We have been. We certainly have been.
And we still are. I mean, to a point.
But I think we are coming out of that. This process of the law being implanted in our hearts and in our minds.
I mean, humanity sees a whole lot better than they saw. Is that 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Our eyes have been open to that. Are they completely open now? Do we see everything? No, we don't.
Right. We still have a lot to learn.
Yeah, sure. But we've learned a lot. Don't ever forget that,
Exactly.
That's counseling 101 there. When you're counseling somebody, or if you're trying to help somebody out, you got to encourage people.
Absolutely.
And on that, we're going to say, come back next week and we'll finish this up.
Yeah.
So you're going to answer all your questions. Yeah.
Not that, but we will touch on a lot of topics.
Yeah.
Probably a little bit less controversial next week.
Hopefully we'll be on time.
Yeah.
I mean, we were ready. 10:30, boom, we were counting down from,
we were totally ready to go, but it was Google Hangouts.
It must have been.
And in the future, I believe that both you guys, as well as me for my book class, we're going to be moving over to Facebook Live.
We're looking at going Facebook Live, some of the issues there. And if we can ever get our tech team together, we're scattered around and, unfortunately, we're not it. I mean, we need some help here. So if you guys want to come down and spend a couple months or years with us.
That's right. Or anybody want to come in there.
Because it's frustrating. We'll get it figured out and it changes. Every time. It changes.
That is always the way it works. You figure out what button to push, discover you have to press 4 more.
Live streaming, when I first started doing it with Roots of Faith and Ross, push the button and go. Free. Push the button and go. Well, then money, then this, then that. It was free. It was easy. It worked every time. And it had all kinds of bells and whistles. And it's just downhill from there.
Right.
So, so we'll see you guys next Saturday right here.
That's right.
10:30.
10:30, hopefully.
If it just happens to change the Facebook, don't let what Jodell said about going to Facebook scare anybody, because and then when we do that, it'll be fully tested and we'll figure out how to change over and all that good stuff. And traditionally, when Ross he's in the land of Israel, and when he goes out of town, so to speak, leaves me here, I change everything. So,
Right.
or, I'll fix it and say, well, Ross, that's the way we're doing it now.
Right.
So maybe so. I don't know.
Maybe.
We tried it this morning. We tried to get Facebook Live going, but I couldn't get all the settings straight.
I really think it was Google Hangouts. It was really Google Hangouts. It had some glitch, maybe an update. Who knows?
All right.
Well, thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Y'all have a great weekend, and we will see you back. And I will be in St. Francisville again next week. Shabbat Shalom.